Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with John Lewis Gaddis, who is a professor of history at Yale University, also the author of a number of books, most of which are dealing with the Cold War, history of the Cold War, strategy of containment. We now know the Cold War, biography of George Kennan, and also the two books that I have with me here today. This one's called The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past, and this one on Grand Strategy. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Greg. It's good to be with you.
So, look, I've been teaching strategy now for about 20 years, but I was trained as an historian, right? And so people are wondering, like, what are you doing teaching strategy with an historical background? But I think that one of the points that you're making in both these books, which I just held up, is that there's this thing called a historical consciousness that you describe in the book Landscape of History, which it's a particular type of temperament. It's a particular way of looking at the world, and it sort of, I think it more or less is coextensive with the temperament and perspective that you describe as being possessed by the folks who are really good at strategy. And so I was wondering, I mean, one of the questions you ask is, can you teach people to be strategists? And if you can, how different would it be from teaching people to have this historical consciousness?
I think in some ways not greatly different at all, because it seems to me that there's a kind of logic of strategy which transcends time and place and culture. And when you set it out, when you give examples of what you mean by that, it sounds like a platitude. So if, for example, I were to tell you that aspirations can be infinite, but capabilities must be finite, you would say, I knew that all along. You would say, that's a platitude.
It's common sense.
Strategy on that, you know? Well, yes, I think you can build a strategy on that, because history is full of people who lost track of that insight, who let their aspirations exceed their capabilities to the point of complete overstretch and self-defeat. Napoleon being one example of that, Mark Antony being another example of that. This history is littered with people who forgot that aphorism, and the aphorism is just plain common sense. So that's why I say in the book, Greg, I think it's part of the single takeaway from that particular book, that common sense is like oxygen. It gets thinner as you go higher. And I think what we have tried to do in our courses here is working with a wonderful group of students that we know are going to go high, to at the same time instill some common sense in them about these basic principles. And that's how we see strategy.
Right. But I mean, should we be thinking of this as a science? I mean, I think people want strategy to be a science, just like they want history to be a science. But I mean, there are some differences. I mean, I think you say that history and science and art at their best are built on metaphors, but I don't think that's the way people think science works.
No, I think that's probably true. I would say history itself, the discipline in general, is a science, but it's a particular kind of science. It's not a laboratory science where you can come in and repeat experiments and verify things by doing so. It's more an evolutionary science. So it's like geology or paleontology or astronomy. It's like sciences whose subjects are too big to fit into laboratories. The one that I like particularly is that history is like cartography. It's like map making. There is no one correct scale for a map. Maps zoom in and out, depending on what you need them for. And history does the same thing. We do micro topics, we do macro topics. Some of us try to do both at one level or another. So I think we are science, but we are not a laboratory science. We are an evolutionary science, you know. So that is that question. But the question of strategy itself, I think more useful to think of it as a game, because strategy implies that you have an opponent, that you have a rival, and you're playing a game of sort. And maybe it's going to be a cosmic lethal game. Maybe it's going to be just a local, irritating, exasperating game. But some of the rules of games, it seems to me, do sustain themselves, one of which is this idea that your capabilities are never going to match your aspirations, and so you have to make some tough choices. Another one is that it's good to get some training before you get responsibility, right? And what that boils down to, at least in athletics, is that you cannot expect to be very good unless you have a coach. And the coach is going to give you some indication of what the history of the game is. The coach is going to select you for your capabilities to play the game. When you mess up, the coach is going to shriek at you and perhaps throw a chair at you or something like that. But out of it all, you will be a better basketball player or baseball player or whatever for having been coached than not, and just going out and make it up as you go along. I think what we do with our students is coaching. We don't know what the game is going to be. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. Nobody can know the future. But we can prepare our students. We can train our students with a certain amount of strategic coaching. So that's the metaphor I like for strategy, even as I like the evolutionary science method for history in general.
Yeah, I mean, I like this metaphor of sports. I mean, sports, business, war, politics, right? They're all the domain of strategy. But like when you're trying to prepare someone for the game, right, there's no way that you can give that player, right, an exact replica of what they're going to see, right? They're going to see something that they've never seen before. And so you train them by giving them these highly stylized scenarios, right?
And that's what we do in history. That's why we have chapters of books. That's why we have sometimes simulations that we run in class. That's where the value of history is, because history provides those examples, and we can go back and say, here is where Xerxes messed up in invading Greece 2,500 years ago. Maybe you can learn something from this, guys. And we have a whole rich panoply of games that have been played, won, or lost, from which we can extract principles. And that's the way I like to see grand strategy. That's the way we like to teach it. And we, in the past, have even gone to the extreme point at the end of a year of this kind of instruction, of actually running what the military call murder boards, in which the students have to come in coat and tie. They have to have a PowerPoint presentation. They have to present it to us. And we were role-playing impatient secretaries of state or defense or CIA directors or whatnot, our friend John Negroponte, who was the first director of national intelligence, was sitting in on this one day. And he was amazed. He said he'd never seen anything as rough as that in Washington. We really gave them a hard time in doing that. But that's no different from what a coach is doing, giving the team a hard time because they will learn something from it. And I think that's the way to teach grand strategy. Not necessarily the way to study grand strategy if you're writing a book about it, but for teaching, I think that's a very good way to do it.
Well, I was trained as an economic historian, and we were told that we were supposed to, construct hypotheses and then, go and test those hypotheses by looking at historical data. And we were told to construct models and, figure out which variables are exogenous and which ones are endogenous. And this was primarily because we were interested in figuring out what the underlying causes were, because we were looking for policy implications, right? We're looking to figure out, how can we learn from the past so that we can, better shape the future? I mean,
and that's the way prediction would be done. You would look for the timeless patterns that are there. The only trouble is most of the theories don't work. And I think because there are too many exogenous factors, so just take economics. The classic theory for a long time was that free trade lifts all boats. But the history of the United States in the last 20 years or so indicates that's not true. So right there is a bumping up of theory against actual practice, against actual history, that is going to have to require some reconsideration, it seems to me, about the theories. And that's my sense. Theory can be useful in aggregating data. Theory is useful in seeing patterns in the past, but its predictive value, it seems to me, when you get to human affairs, is quite limited. And you have to be prepared for surprises.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the difference between particular generalization and general particularization. I was wondering if you could dig into that.
Yeah, sure. Well, particular generalizations would be if you were to take the history of revolutions and say, is there any pattern as to when a revolution breaks out historically? And you can say a particular generalization might be, and this is Tocqueville, when people's expectations have risen to a certain point, but have not been satisfied. So, but we would never say that all revolutions are going to break out that way. We would just say there's a historical pattern there. General particularization is where you privilege the generalities, where you're trying to build a theory for all revolutions, and you say all of them are going to result from that kind of thing, from the rising expectations. But that's not true. They don't. The Russian Revolution, for example, arose from Russia blundering into World War I, which had already dashed a lot of expectations, and yet they had one of the bloodiest revolutions anywhere. So the same would apply to China. So that works in certain situations, but it's not an all-purpose theory for how history works. That's why we say generalization has to be bounded by historical reality. And we have to acknowledge that some generalizations work in some situations and others don't.
So what then is the role of theory in making sense of the past? I mean, you don't abandon it, but you can't be too rigid with it.
It's very much what we see AI doing today, which is aggregating vast amounts of data. Because if we didn't have theory, if we couldn't go back and say that there's some relationship between what Napoleon did and what Hitler did, for example, we'd be very impoverished. And so we would look back at that. We would look back at the causes of revolution. We would look back at the reasons why monarchy transitioned to republicanism to the extent that it did. We'd look back to why the Protestant Reformation occurred and what was going on there. And yes, there are ways of aggregating data on this that make it possible for us to write books. And that's a kind of theory as well. But to say that those patterns are going to continue indefinitely into the future, to say that we can continue to, we can choose the next pope in an effort to avoid future Protestant reformations, nobody at the conclave is going to say that. They're going to look at the immediate situation. They're going to look at the immediate history of the late pope. And they're going to be thinking about the immediate future of the church. So theory is limited, it seems to me, in that regard.
Well, I mean, I think that history seems to sit somewhere between the sciences and the humanities, right? I don't know where it belongs. I mean, it seems to be sort of, between these two stools.
Well, that's why I like cartography as a metaphor, because you're right. It's exactly between two stools, but that's what a map is. There's no perfect map. Large-scale maps have their purposes. Small-scale maps have their purposes. And so for us, you could be doing history on the grandest scale, like writing a history of grand strategy that extends for 2,500 years, which is one that you were kind enough to mention a while ago. So that is really, really zooming out to look for larger patterns. But then look at what I'm working on right now, which is a completely different topic. I'm doing a micro-history of the tiny and very violent little town that I grew up in Southwest Texas. The town was founded in the 1880s. It quickly became the bloodiest town in all of Texas, which is saying something. And that was true for about 25 years. And then it settled down and everybody started growing onions. And so I've always been fascinated by that history, which we learned as little kids. And what I'm doing now is taking advantage of a new technology, which is digital newspapers, to go back and do a microhistory, almost a day-by-day history of that tiny little town. And I'm having as much fun doing that as I did writing the 2,500-year history on grand strategy. It makes people nervous. Yes, I would admit that. It makes fellow historians nervous. And it certainly makes publishers nervous. And they say, why is this guy doing this? It's because he doesn't want to be bored. And history is a very good profession for people who don't want to be bored.
Yeah, when people ask me, like, what's the most important skill you get out of a strategy class, sometimes I say it's knowing when and how to zoom in and zoom out, right? And people are like, what the heck? Like, what does that even mean? But it seems like when you're writing a history, right, you're making all sorts of editorial decisions about, when you need to zoom in and when you need to zoom out. And you can, be giving a minute by minute description of something. And then the next thing you're just, zooming past an entire country and an entire century. In the same way when you're writing a novel, right? If you're Tolstoy, I mean, it's very similar.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Tolstoy because in my freshman class, which I teach, I'm the first person they see when they walk in the door in September. And I'll have 18 or 20 students in there. And the required reading is every line of War and Peace. And because they're freshmen, they don't know that that's double the normal reading load for a freshman for any seminar at Yale.
Wait, do undergraduates actually do that now? I thought that they stopped reading.
They do. Yes, they do. And they love it because they haven't read it. They fall in love with it immediately. They get hooked on it. We take all semester to do it. We don't do it as an overnight. But they're fascinated by it. And what they love is the in and out, zooming in, zooming out that he does. The great battles, of course, but also the great immediate characters, which they identify. The bumbling Pierre, they love Pierre because he reminds them of themselves as bumbling freshmen, who have a lot to learn yet. And so they just latch on to Tolstoy beautifully. But Tolstoy himself has one of the best theories of history, which is embedded in that last chapter, which nobody reads, of War and Peace, where he says there are all kinds of levels of causation. There are big things that happen, but there are tiny things that happen, and some of the tiny things that happen are so tiny that we have no knowledge of them, no perception of them, no way to measure them. And so we have the illusion of free will, but we don't actually have free will. That's getting very close for the 19th century to 21st century quantum physics, in which we don't know what those tiniest particles are, and we have no way of measuring them. So all of this combines, it seems to me.
Well, you also have to decide when to start the story, right? Like, when do you, what's the thing that sort of, I mean, economists like to say, okay, we've got an equilibrium and then there's an exogenous shock, and, they're telling a story. And they've made decisions about what they're going to, call exogenous and what they're going to call endogenous. I don't think they see themselves as, writing a story. But I mean, this is one of the problems I had when I was writing history was I don't know where to start because, everything had something that, I remember at one time when I was in college, I was supposed to write a final paper on, the causes of National Socialism. And oh my gosh, I got an incomplete and I spent like 2 years, kept going back. I went all the way back to, the Germanic tribes. I mean, where do you stop? I mean, there's no objective place where you stop.
Yeah, you have to think of it as a picture that you're painting. One of the other best books to read on doing history is Churchill's Painting as a Pastime. And he talks about the discipline of fitting the depiction of a landscape or a person or whatever, or a building within the discipline of the frame that you have available. And the frame that you have available when you're writing a history, ultimately, if you're going to publish it, is the very real fact that a publisher is not going to publish a 50,000-page book. You have to stop somewhere. And you're not going to do a good job of waiting until you can depict 50,000 years in, unless you're some really cosmic super historian. So they're just practicalities that are involved. If you're teaching a course, you have a semester to do it in. You have a certain period twice a week in which you do it. You have to make it fit the frame. It's not greatly different from, I think, movie directing or theater directing, where you're putting things into a frame. I think we do that all the time, really, because without frames, it would be very difficult to navigate the world, it seems to me.
Now, this book on history, I mean, it follows in the footsteps of Mark Bloch and E.H. Carr and R.G. Collingwood and all those folks. And I remember when I was in grad school, I read all those, and we did have sort of a year-long first-year workshop on historiography. And I get the sense that historians who today, they don't really spend a lot of time on historiography. And maybe they haven't always, maybe they've never spent a lot of time on historiography. I think you said that the profession is sort of averse to the Pompidou right, approach where you make your methodology explicit. Why is that? I mean, is it just because it's hard to articulate what you're doing when you're doing it?
I think it's partly that. I think it's also the fact that the archives are so fascinating that it's very possible just to dig into the archives and never be seen again, sink into them, because they are so rich in many cases. We do have a tendency just to kind of make up the method as we go along. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to say something about the historical method. But I think there's another reason, too. We, over the years, have felt defensive because you guys in economics and in political science and whatnot, the social sciences, claim to have methods and spend a lot of time discussing methods and whatnot. And you've managed to intimidate us. And so we feel inferior to you. I think that's wrong. I don't think we're inferior to you. I think we have our own methods. It's just they are the methods of this evolutionary science, and that can be described, and cartography is one way to get at it. But I think it's partly that where the resistance to theory comes from.
Well, I mean, not only has history been on the defensive against social scientists who say it's not a real science, but they've also been on the defensive against the postmodern critique, which is that you're just, writing fiction, right? So, I mean, it is very similar to fiction in a lot of ways, but how do you defend against that accusation that it's just you're making editorial decisions, you're imposing your view of the world, you are guilty of presentism and so forth?
I would say what's new. We've been doing that all along. Everybody does that. Nobody starts at the beginning. Everybody is imposing some kind of a model. Even the most rigorous theorists are imposing some kind of a model. Even the most rigorous quantum physicists have models in mind before they go down and try to test them. So all of us are trying to fit something to something else, fit something, some representation to some reality. And again, it's like map making. Map makers have reality to cope with, which is the world out there. But a map that was correspondent with the world and was included every detail of the world would be totally useless. It would be the world. And so everybody is, I think, stuck with that artificiality that the postmodernists are talking about. Yes, we're representing reality, but how do they think our brains work in the first place? Our brains, all those neurons, are not reality. They're representing reality. They're interpreting it for us. So I have little patience for that argument.
Well, I mean, this idea of historical consciousness, I mean, it seems like it necessarily implies some amount of moderation or balance, right? I mean, one could presumably be held captive by history. I mean, we always talk about fighting the last war. So if you're a good strategist, how much history do you need to know? I mean, presumably a lot of the folks that you're describing, they weren't schooled in history. I mean, I know Lincoln probably was, and George Washington knew history. But I mean, presumably there are some folks that are just really good strategists with very little background of history.
Well, Lincoln is a fascinating case because he had less than 1 year of formal education. And yet I treat him as not only the greatest president, but the greatest American strategist as well. And what he had, it seems to me, and this is really the foundation of strategy, is what I would call common sense. That is the knowledge that wise people always have, that capabilities are finite, aspirations are infinite. You have to make some kind of an adjustment, some kind of a compromise. Isaiah Berlin would put it in terms of incommensurate good things. You might have good things that are out there, good options, several good options, but you cannot pursue them all at once. Pursuit of one precludes maybe another one. So, for example, in the Civil War, obviously getting rid of slavery was a good thing. But also saving the lives of soldiers and civilian population, that's also a good thing. Yeah. So how does Lincoln weigh this? Increasingly, he put weight on the need to fight this war all the way through, whatever it cost. That's not where he started. And all the way through, he is weighing competing goods with each other. And he says this, he says, he says, events have guided me. And I think that's the way leadership occurs. A good leader will know the importance of balancing aspirations and capabilities. But because the good leader doesn't know what the future is, that balance has to be recalculated all the time. And in the process of recalculating it, you have to keep in mind, particularly in a democracy, will the country you're leading actually go for it? Will they stand for it? And sometimes they will, and sometimes they won't. And the really good leaders like Lincoln, like FDR, for example, had their ears to the ground, listening to what people were saying as well, and very carefully measured this. So that's where genius lies, it seems to me, in the field of grand strategy, is the ability to hold that balance. Or, as Scott Fitzgerald famously said, in what is kind of our class motto for the grand strategy program, the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time and not go crazy.
Right. I mean, this seems like, the strategic mindset seems like phronesis, right? I mean, it seems like practical wisdom. But you can have practical wisdom and presumably not be a great strategist, right? I mean, you said something like it's common sense plus this leadership, right? It's a combination of those two.
Well, I make the difference. I say in the book, grand strategy depends on who you are and what stage in life you are at. So deciding where to go out and get a pizza in New Haven would not necessarily be a grand strategic decision for my students. But deciding what courses to take, what major to pursue at Yale, who to fall in love with, where to get a job after graduation, what is the alternative to going to New York and working for Morgan's, which it seems like sometimes half of them do. Those are very grand decisions for them at that age, So I think it's, again, depending on scale. Whatever is important to you is grand. And as your own responsibilities increase, then the visibility of what you're going to decide will also increase. The number of people that you affect will increase. And with a certain amount of prominence, and then maybe good luck or bad luck, you'll wind up in the history books.
Now, of course, I always identified with the fox, and I always thought that, these folks are all foxes. But I think you say that they really also have a little bit of hedgehog in them, right? I mean, they're foxes with compasses, right?
I'm saying good grand strategists are both. And that's the Fitzgerald idea, because the fox has the advantage of situational awareness and agility and cleverness. But the fox often has no particular sense of direction. The hedgehog will have a strong sense of direction, but will wander off a cliff because it's looking off into the distance, because it is not paying attention to the situation right now, So if I were just to transfer this very quickly to current politics, I would say the ultimate fox that we've had for a long time has not been anybody quite as foxy as he is. The current president of the United States is a total fox, and he's exceedingly clever in that regard. That's how he's gotten to where he is right now. His opponents, mostly in the Democratic Party, I think have been hedgehogs over the years because they perceived certain big ideas like open boundaries, or like political correctness, or like free trade, or like NATO expansion, or things like that, And they let those means actually become ends in themselves without defining what those were supposed to accomplish or what the end point would be or what the problems might be created along the way. And each one of those things created problems along the way. So I think the optimal grand strategist would be someone who is agile and situationally aware, but also retains a sense of direction. And that's why Steven Spielberg in the Lincoln movie so brilliantly caught Lincoln saying, if he's saying, I need to have a compass, I need to have a heading, I need to know where I'm going. But if all I do is look at the compass, I'm going to fall into a swamp somewhere. I have to be looking around at the same time. That is the art of politics. And I think it's been missing in lots of ways in this country in the post-Cold War period.
So in other words, our current president is someone who is capable of responding almost instantaneously to changes in circumstance.
Yes,
but
and writing 40 tweets about it.
Yeah, but it's not clear what his objective is.
No, exactly. So if you look, try to back off. Look, this weekend is the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and you look at the New York Times this morning, they're listing all the different things that Trump has done. To what end? What is his end point? Some would say it's just the glorification of Donald Trump, but what's the point of that? Where is the country along the way? And so what he's galvanizing is a resistance movement that's beginning. I think it began really quite significantly this week at Harvard, of all places, as far as universities are concerned. But there's going to be more of it as time goes on. Simply because Trump isn't thinking through what the end point is, what the point of sustainability is. So in one sense, I think it's good to have the conventional wisdom, all of the hedgehog ideas challenged and maybe roughed up a little bit. But at the other end, total chaos is not going to be a good thing either. And so I think we will have to come back to some kind of a new balance between the long-term priorities and the strategic adjustments that need to be made. And I think, Greg, that if you look at the history of the Cold War itself, the history of containment, that was a pretty good strategy in balancing ultimate objectives, which were always to maintain the global balance of power without nuclear war breaking out, with agility, with things that took advantage of situations. The Marshall Plan, for example, the use of the U-2 and the development of overhead reconnaissance, for example, the Nixon-Kissinger reversal of policy with regard to China, or even Reagan with SDI. Those are all unexpected moves. They were all foxy adjustments, which caught the adversary, whoever that was, off guard, but ultimately fit within the larger strategy of maintaining the balance of power. That's what I'm missing in the post-Cold War era, and I think that's what we have to get back to.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that, Donald Trump is using kind of, five-dimensional strategy. Like he's just so, his strategy is so sophisticated that nobody understands it except for him.
Yep, which means you're making it up as you go along.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's funny, when I teach entrepreneurs, I use a similar metaphor about how they should fall in love with their ends, but not their means, right? So, fixate on the problem that you're trying to solve, but be very, very flexible about the solution that you're going to use. You have to have sort of an almost irrational pursuit of the goal, but an extreme humility with respect to the reality that you encounter. And it seems like
at the same time, I think you have to realize naive questions are always good to ask, because one of the problems with theorists is that they don't like naive questions because they're inconvenient. And they're much more interested in the purity of the theory, the rigorousness of the theory, if it's a laboratory science, the replicability of the theory. But for somebody to come along and just ask a naive question, sometimes they're not prepared, for that. So, for example, we're having discussions here on NATO expansion almost 25 years ago when it was first brought up. And we would have briefers who would come in and tell us how well it was going to work, how smoothly the Brussels committees would adjust to the incorporation of Eastern European states and whatnot. And one of us asked one day, isn't it possible that NATO expansion could alienate the newly democratic Russian state under Boris Yeltsin, turn it back to authoritarianism and drive it into the arms of China, thereby undoing one of the great achievements of the Cold War, the Sino-Soviet split? The briefer admitted, just in front of a great audience, that we had never thought of that. And that's the kind of thing, it seems to me, that has to happen. Just on, you just look around you. Say you believe in the gospel of free trade lifting all boats, but then go to small towns, drive across the country. Look at my small town, and you'll see a lot of people out of work, a lot of people in despair, a lot of people finding refuge in drugs, all of that. We know the story. Look at immigration. Sure, it sounds good to have open borders in that way and to have maximum immigration. We know that the country has thrived on that. But go to Eagle Pass, Texas, which is very close to where I grew up, and look at our Del Rio and look at what was happening there last year when those borders were still open. And then look at what happened when Governor Abbott started transporting migrants on buses to downtown New York and put them up in the Roosevelt Hotel. This, I think, should have been and could have been foreseen, these things. And that's what I think we lose by not just asking naive questions. What is actually happening to real people in applying these theories?
So, I mean, why is it that leaders of organizations and countries and armies don't entertain these questions? I mean, why doesn't somebody say, hey, what happens if the Russian army retreats from Moscow? What happens if we, encounter more resistance in Sicily than we thought? I mean, presumably, that means that no one ever sat around and asked these questions. Why? Why don't the leaders welcome these questions?
I think what happens in complex organizations is a kind of a preoccupation with process. The organizations are so complex and the processes of running them are so demanding, and the PowerPoint slides representing the processes are so incomprehensible that everybody just gets caught up in the weeds. Everybody gets caught up in the actual process. And how do we make this work? How do we relate subunit X25J to subunit 54.7 or something like that, and policy schools, public policy schools, wrap themselves around the axle on this. This is the kind of minutia that they are often teaching to young people, And if you just back off and ask, well, what is it for? What are we trying to do? You will get, people will look at you condescendingly. They will kind of worry about your naivete, And yet, that's what we were doing when we said, okay, what is going to be the end point of NATO expansion? And our briefers could not tell us. I think we got it more right than they did along the way.
Well,
I think you have to do both, and that is that's where history really comes in and is helpful.
So, getting back to teaching of strategy, if we're teaching strategy to, say, business leaders, political leaders, and so forth, what does that curriculum look like? And how much history would be in that curriculum? I know right now in business schools, when we're teaching folks strategy, we will walk through the cognitive biases, we'll walk through a little bit of psychology and so forth, decision theory, we'll walk through, economics. But history is not a topic in business schools.
Well, that's funny, Greg, that you mentioned that, because when I wrote on-grant strategy, I was writing it for my own students. We were no longer teaching that seminar. One of the three of us had died at that point, and I was just interested in putting down in a book what we had thought we were trying to say to our students. And so it was really written for students. That's the voice of it as well. I was flummoxed to have it winding up on management school reading lists, and this continues. To this day, I get invitations, to come and talk to business people about this. And it's kind of a sleeper that has found utility in business. I certainly did not write it with that in mind and know nothing about the people that I'm talking to or what they're concerned about. But I think what it shows is that well-packaged history that is presented in a series of fairly small, clearly written units, but with some coherence and some color, and maybe even some sense of humor, can be quite attractive. Not in telling somebody what to do in making a business decision, but in inculcating a kind of framework of mind, which would be to say that for every micro decision you make, there has to be some macro purpose that informs it. That for every rise in status that you achieve, you're likely to lose touch. You're further away from the ground. And what's happening on the ground is very important. So this whole thing about preserving common sense at all altitudes, it seems to me, is something that's often missing in business schools and also in businesses, as we've seen in various cases. So if reading some history can create that kind of attitude, then I think it's worthwhile. And the reason I think it can work gets back to the sports metaphor, because, okay, maybe your business guy is not interested in reading history, but they're probably watching the March Madness or the Super Bowl, and they're probably talking about coaches and why are certain coaches better than other coaches and so on. And when they're doing that, they're talking about what I'm talking about, which is just drawing these lessons from the past, looking at the objective, operating within the rules, but understanding that the application of the rules is going to be different in every situation, every moment of the game. I think if you put it in those terms, then you can get it across. I'm not enough of a sports addict, to make this very convincing. And my students kind of shake their heads pitifully when I try to talk about sports, But nonetheless, it does seem to me that is the bridge, that is the field that most closely connects what I'm doing with what these guys are doing.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like there's also a moral dimension to history. And I think, that is something that people are sometimes wary of, right? And they try to disavow the moral judgment that is necessarily a part of any kind of historical account. So on the one hand, why is it that we cannot get rid of our moral judgment, and why is it that we are averse to owning it and embracing it?
No, I think that's pretty clear. It's because we fear death. We don't know what's coming after. And so that fear of the unknown, I think, has always motivated religions, and it continues to. And people develop faiths, try to develop faiths for reassuring themselves about that. And the whole history of religion, it seems to me. I take that very seriously in the book. As you know, there's a chapter that puts together St. Augustine with Machiavelli, which is kind of an odd combination. But St. Augustine was wrestling with this question: how do you have a church and keep it pure and at the same time take advantage of the protection afforded by the state? Knowing that if the state were not there, there'd be no church because all the Christians would have been fed to lions or something. So you make a judgment. You cannot adapt the principles of the founder of the religion, turn the other cheek in all situations. In some situations, you must live by the sword, as the founder also said. And so how do you know which is which? And this is where the grand strategy comes in. Augustine talked about proportionality. You proportion what needs to be done to what you have available. And that is grand strategy. That is making that linkage between aspirations on the one hand, meaning saving your soul, and your capabilities, which may mean betraying your neighbor under a certain situation, or one or two. So I think that's very important, and I think it's too often neglected by people who write about grand strategy.
Yeah, but what I meant is, when we're creating accounts of the past, we're describing events in the past, we necessarily are judging, right? The actors, judging the participants, right? I mean, why is that not presentism?
It is presentism, and presentism is not all bad, because the past is always interpreted in terms of what we are interested in today, what concerns us today. And I don't fear presentism at all. Presentism causes us to ask new questions. So the whole revolution in the American understanding of the Civil War, the importance of slavery, came as a result of the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. That's presentism, The development of women's history, to the extent that it's now a major field, came as a result of the revolution of the rights of women that followed so closely on the civil rights movement. The present always affects how we interpret the past. But we need to be aware that that process is happening. We need to not be blinded by that. We need to say that this is one way of understanding things. This is how we understand things now. We may understand them differently in the future, and we have understood them differently in the past. One of the things I do in my biography class is to assign a book on John C. Calhoun. And we had quite a controversy here at Yale about 10 years ago.
Well, I think that they keep, his name is still there, right?
His name is still there, but it's now Grace Hopper College, and that was a very controversial thing to take that name off. But the reason the name was there was because back in the 1930s, Yale was trying to get kids from the South to enroll. They were competing with Princeton. And so when they built those colleges, they just put Calhoun's name on one. Nothing more sophisticated than that, So that was presentism. And it was also presentism when, after one of the dining hall employees broke a stained glass window showing slaves picking cotton. And that's what tipped off the renaming of the college, That was presentism itself also. But you can't escape it. That's the way it works.
Yeah, but it seems like the sin of presentism is when you fail to make an effort to put yourself in the position of the actors, right, within their context.
Sure. I mean, the sin of presentism is when you are superficial. The sin of presentism is when you look at everything in the light of, say, some event like the death of George Floyd, for example. And then you say that white people have always mistreated black people throughout all of history. We know that from the death of George Floyd. That is oversimplifying.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to look at the current situation in the Ukraine and Russia, I mean, are there any comparisons or lessons that we can learn from the containment and from the Cold War that we're not actually acknowledging or learning from?
Sure. There are quite a number, and some of them people don't like to talk about very much. For example, George Kennan, the architect of containment, was extraordinarily vehement in saying Ukraine is part of Russia. And he said that because of history, because Russian Orthodoxy began in Kiev with St. Vladimir, the same thing Putin is saying, about 1000 AD or something like that. Russian Orthodox culture, basic to Russian culture throughout the history, has come from that region. So Kennan would have said it's not going to work to have Ukraine separate. He was perfectly prepared to accept the need for the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, to be separate, but not Ukraine. Well, today we have a somewhat different view of this, and Putin, in trying to take over Ukraine, has actually built a Ukrainian nationalism, a Ukrainian culture that really wasn't there historically. The language was there, but most Ukrainians, I thought, I probably felt as much Russian as Ukrainian throughout most of that history. Not now. And now there is a strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism, and even if Putin takes it over completely, he's going to have a running sore that's going to make the Gaza or the West Bank look like peanuts in this situation. You know, so this is just the strange way that history works. It seems to me, but it's always there. It's always relevant, and I think you just have to be sensitive to the complexities of it. Yeah.
So it seems like Putin is falling prey to the same problem that Napoleon fell prey to. He presumably didn't have anybody in his inner circle who said, hey, what happens if we encounter a little bit of resistance?
Yeah, I think that's right. He's been careful in the sense that he's edging into Ukraine. He's not just flat invading it the way Napoleon did. You could argue that back in February of 22, he tried it, and he lost all those tanks on the road to Kiev and decided it was a bad idea. And he backtracked, which is something Napoleon did not do. But nonetheless, his objective, I think, is no less ambitious than what Napoleon's was. But in both cases, look what happened. Napoleon generated resistance to himself among the Russians, and that, together with geography and together with weather, is what did him in, really. And Putin has generated Ukrainian nationalism in a big way, with the effect that Ukraine now has a very vigorous national culture. Ukraine is now a major weapons builder in its own right, and the decision to invade Ukraine has, for Pete's sake, pushed Finland and Sweden into NATO. Could Putin really have wanted to come out with the entire Baltic Sea being a NATO sea, as it is now? So it was not, I would say, a well-calculated decision. The difference is that Putin is going to just stick it out, kind of in the way that the World War I generals were telling each other, we will stick it out in trench warfare, despite the fact that we have lost 50,000 men trying to take half a kilometer. We'll just stick it out for a few more years. You know, I think Putin is doing that kind of game right now and just waiting for us to get tired. But then what? Does he have a peaceful, happy province on his hands? I don't think so.
Now, one of the heroes of the book is FDR. And you quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, you know, second-rate intellect, first-rate temperament. And it seems like you could apply that also to Ronald Reagan in a way, right? I mean, has the consensus on Reagan's presidency shifted? I mean, I remember I was alive in college during the Reagan years, and there is, I mean, it seems like the debate then was very, very different from what we see now in retrospect.
These things happen, Greg. You know, there was the idea that Eisenhower was just a dunce, you know, a lightweight, you know, partly from his experience as president of Columbia. It's not that he deeply engaged with the university he ran in those years, you know, but he's now regarded as one of the most successful, and certainly in terms of grand strategy, one of the most successful presidents of the post-war period. The same has happened with Reagan. I was one of the very, very few, I think, at the end of the Reagan administration, who were saying this guy over time is going to look better than he does right now. But that's now the consensus, you know, and there's not great argument about that. You know, he's rated as one of the great presidents, you know, for sure. You never know where things are going to come out. It's always interesting and entertaining to make comparisons to presidents. I would just say that with regard to FDR and Reagan, and Truman, as far as that goes, they were prepared to operate within the rules, constitutionally and politically, and to work within that system, even as they did revolutionary things. And I'm less sure about Trump. I don't think he has guardrails. And I worry about what the effect of that is going to be. Ultimately, I think we will develop guardrails. That's what I meant when I said the resistance is already beginning to build. That's happening. And I think it'll happen fairly quickly now. But there is a deeper challenge here to the guardrails than we've had since the Constitution was founded, really, I think.
Yeah, it's curious how there can be such a divide. I mean, Reagan was perceived as an extremist. He was perceived as, inflexible. He was perceived as dangerous. And yet, in retrospect, we see that he was someone who was always willing to compromise, always willing to, make deals, take what he could get, work with his opponents and rivals. And
yeah, but Greg, I mean, people at the time when Reagan was in office, they didn't know how it was all going to come out. We know. That makes us a little more self-confident, I think.
Now, look, in the end of the book, the history book, you say that historical consciousness is actually it's an essential ingredient to identity, something super fundamental. So, I mean, how can you defend that position? What does that mean exactly?
Well, I think that identity is a matter of certainly drawing on your own experiences, first of all. So this is your upbringing, this is your nurturing, this is your education, this is your profession, this is your lover, all of these things. And that forms identity. But if we can move beyond our own personal identities and experience the identities of others throughout time, if we can sample identities of others, I think we grow as a result. That's why reading fiction is so pleasant. That's why seeing movies, we go to see movies. That's why we like Shakespeare, because it enhances our identities by exposing us vicariously to other identities. My wife also teaches at Yale and is a theater director. And she has this week done her 12th Venetian Baroque opera. And you might ask, well, what is the value of a Venetian Baroque opera program in a university like Yale? And the answer is it's hugely popular. The place was packed, university theater. And it's because the music was totally unfamiliar. And it was because they were hearing something for the first time that had not been heard for 300 years. And it was because they were listening to undergraduate singers singing in Baroque Italian, which is something you don't hear very often. So the very expansion of identity, both for the students who were involved in that production, but also for the people who came from the audience, is enriching, inherently enriching. But that's just a microcosm of what is supposed to happen at this place and at other places like us. And that's why maintaining good universities, both private and public, certainly should be a major priority. I am no apologist in any way for the political correctness trend that has swept universities. And I think one good thing that's happening is that that's under challenge now in a way that it has not been before. But we cannot throw out, this is a baby in bathwater situation, you have to save the baby even if you throw out the bathwater. And that's what we're right on the cusp of right now. How do we do that?
Well, maybe we can end with one of your heroes who is both at the beginning and at the end of On Grand Strategy, which of course is Isaiah Berlin. And you end the book by talking about, positive and negative liberty, and how just like throughout the book, right, everything is about balance and everything is about figuring out, I guess, challenging these dichotomies. Could you talk a bit about how do those concepts relate to strategy?
Well, Berlin has not normally been thought of as a strategist. He's been thought of as a philosopher. And as I say in the intro, I knew him a little bit the last time I was at Oxford. I think he'd be highly amused to be regarded as a grand strategist. But his philosophy was what he called pluralism. And that sounds like mush, if you just use that word. But as you probe more deeply, you see that he was talking about these two mindsets, the mindset of the fox and the mindset of the hedgehog, which was something he got from the ancient Greeks, but also he applied it to Tolstoy and others. And he's right, that idea, the difference between the fox knowing many things and the hedgehog knowing one big thing, it's just an amazingly fruitful metaphor that he came up with. It's been very helpful, I think, to a lot of people over the years in thinking through decision making. But it was not just that. It was also this idea that I mentioned of the tragedy that you cannot have all good things at once. The incommensurability of good things. Good things are not all compatible with each other. So politics is very largely a matter of choosing between good things, which means you have to shove some aside or postpone some in order to get some others. And timing is important. So Berlin wrote the great essay on that, and that's his essay on Machiavelli. And then on positive and negative liberty, you would think positive liberty would be a good thing, but not in Berlin's terminology. Positive liberty is when you are told what to do at every level. You don't have to make any difficult choices. And so you feel free by following the instructions of the autocrat, whoever that is. And that leads to totalitarianism, and it leads to tragedy and all of that. Negative liberty is being given the freedom to choose for yourself. And that is where democracy lies, you see. And that distinction itself, I think, is very important as we get through this. A very good measure is, does this proposed legislation, does this proposed course of action tilt us more toward positive liberty in which we are told what to do at all levels, or toward negative liberty in which we are left to ourselves to decide what we want to do? And of course, both things happen in government and in administration and in walks of life all the time. So Berlin was great at posing dichotomies, fox and hedgehog, positive, negative liberty. He's difficult to read because he's an Oxford Don, and he really writes as if he was lecturing. And so there are very long sentences and complex constructions. But the ideas are eminently teachable if they can be presented in the right way. And so this course that I do here on foxes and hedgehogs really is a course on Isaiah Berlin as a grand strategist.
Well, I look forward to taking a look at those syllabi, and maybe I can copy them and start teaching something similar here at Berkeley. So thanks so much, John. Appreciate it. And don't forget this book on grand strategy. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.